On the face of it, there couldn't probably be two more different writers to be discussing rather than Sherwood Anderson and D.H. Lawrence. What I found out actually on the way here is that Sherwood Anderson actually went through a hugely influential Laurentian phase in the last part of his life, where he wrote a series of stories profoundly influenced by D.H. Lawrence, and the critic Malcolm Cowley described them as the very worst of all of his writing. So perhaps it's better to sort of stick to what he knows. And perhaps the reason why Sherwood Anderson and D.H. Lawrence are so different is that what we just heard from David is very erudite and very thoughtful and very literary kind of exposition of why we write and how we write. Sherwood wasn't really like that. He would describe himself as a storyteller, and a storyteller first and foremost. And when you actually come to read his stories, what you'll find is that they do feel kind of gossipy, barflyish. He's interested in telling a story, and there's a lot of kind of verbal tics within all of his stories, which make you do feel like you're listening to someone who is just kind of sitting next to you in a cafe, or perhaps sidling up to you in a bus garage. And sometimes they're pleasant to hear, and other times you're kind of like, please, I've had quite enough, let's go. But when I first came across Sherwood Anderson, quite by chance, just out of interest, how many people have read any Sherwood Anderson? That's actually way more than I expected. I first came across him at an exhibition. George Bellows, the American painter, realist painter, who was a direct contemporary of Sherwood Anderson, and in fact, we were both born in Ohio. And he had a retrospective at the Royal Academy, and in the very last room, there's this huge room full of these kind of vast Vermeer-inspired paintings, which were, well, if not blasted, but not particularly well received at the time. And the very last plaque, the epitaph was written by Sherwood Anderson. Sherwood Anderson wrote this about George Bellows. He said, Bellows' paintings, he wrote, keep telling you things. They are telling you that George Bellows died too young. They are telling you that he was after something, that he was always after it. Now, after having gone through the whole sweep of George Bellows' his artistic life, a couple of things occurred to me. The first thing was that this guy, Sherwood Anderson, who I knew the name but had never read any of, had absolutely encapsulated this man's artistic life in 2 sentences. And what he had done also is he'd managed to do it by making it sound like a compliment. He tried to make him sound, if you take that line again, his paintings keep telling you things. They are telling you that he died too young. They're telling you that he was after something, that he was always after it, which sounds positive, right? That sounds like a positive thing, a drive, his artistic striving, and all that kind of thing. And then you start looking at it properly, and you actually think about what he's actually saying. What exactly are the paintings telling us? Just something. What was he after with such vigour? We don't know. He was just after it. And then a death to die too young, aren't all deaths too young? So what he managed to say was what on the face of it, straight away felt like a summation of a man that was very positive, but at the end actually came across with a way of saying, well, actually, when you look at George Bellows' life, he was always after something. He just never attained it. He never got to where he wanted to be. He never quite became the man that he wanted to be. And then when I started reading about Sherwood Anderson, I realised that could be his own epitaph. Sherwood Anderson never really became the writer that he wanted to be. He never really had the moment in the sun that other writers, later writers like Faulkner, like Hemingway, who were disciples of Anderson, who worshipped him. He never had those moments. And the question is why? Was it a lack of talent? Was it a lack of application? Was it just poor luck? And in truth, it's probably all of those things. But the important thing is, to me at least, is what drove people to be interested in this writer? What was it that first became that kind of influential figure? And how important is that anyway? Because the important thing to remember that if you know anything about Sherwood Anderson these days, There's two things that you'll know. Either he was influential or he wrote Winsberg Ohio. Those are the only two things that you'll really, really know. He did have a best-selling novel called Paul White in the 1920s. But if you read any kind of critical essay on Sherwood Anderson anywhere, you will always find the same kind of thing, which is that the critical reception is mixed. So in the introduction to the copy that I've got of Sherwood Anderson's Winsberg Ohio, Malcolm Crowley, critic, was writing this introduction in 1960. So this is only 40 years after the book has been published. And already, throughout this essay, Malcolm's like, he was good, but it's very mixed, very uneven. These are the words that you hear all the time with Sherwood Anderson. Mixed, uneven, wrote too much, didn't write in the same way, never really understood the concept of the novel. Was too interested and too intrigued by the voice. And that puts Malcolm Crowley in a bit of a problem, because he's got an introduction to a book which he clearly doesn't like very much. So he has to let a light on something. He has to have something. And this is what he writes. And he kind of leaps on it with glee. He says that Anderson was the only storyteller of his generation who left his mark on the style and vision of the generation that followed. Hemingway, Faulkner, Woolf, Steinbeck, Caldwell, Sarayan, Henry Miller, each of these owes an unmistakable debt to Anderson. But what does that kind of debt look like? And does it really matter? I think that what happens is that we look at these things and we think, well, why should we read Sherwood Anderson? Is it because Hemingway and Faulkner were influenced by him? Does that make him any more worth reading? Are we just filling in the gaps on a literary chronology and therefore ticking a little box, and when someone says, well, what about Hemingway? And you just go, it's no Sherwood Anderson. And these are the reasons why we do these kinds of things in these kinds of terms as writers and as readers. We do want to know the lineage of these things. But I would argue that there's another reason for reading Sherwood Anderson. I would argue that Sherwood Anderson remains relevant to this day, even though when you first read him, I would wager that you probably wouldn't see it. Now, I think that while we talk about Hemingway and we talk about Faulkner and Steinbeck perhaps, I think his kind of DNA is ghosting about within the lower, more recent short story writers like Raymond Carver, Grace Paley, Joy Williams. He's not there directly, he's not there properly, but he's ghosting around. And if you read Sherwood Anderson, you will see the genesis of some of those points. And I think that's a very important thing, where you can see where those stories came from. But Anderson was not the kind of writer like Raymond Carver or Grace Paley or Jane Ann Phillips or any of those kinds of writers from the latter part of the 20th century. He was an old style writer, a writer that, we probably wouldn't recognise these days. The stories in Winsberg, Ohio were written out straight. They were not edited. He did not edit them. He proudly said that Hans, one of his famous stories, which I'll be talking about in a second, he hadn't changed a single word. He wrote it and he didn't change anything. Now, these days, hyper-editing, nitpicking, workshopping, all the things that we do to try and make sure that our stories are the very, very best they can ever be, whether it's going to extraordinary lengths to read them aloud, read them out, read them to other people, choose different fonts, whatever it might be. Anderson didn't do any of that. He just sat down and he wrote. And the way that he wrote was interesting, and I think perhaps why he was interested in Lawrence and Yeats as well, W.B. Yeats, was that there was this moment in between waking and sleeping where he said that faces came across his eyes, and those faces suddenly were stories, and he had to understand the stories behind those faces. And probably it was his urge to give every one of those faces a story which led him to write so much and perhaps not edit and keep back quite as much as he perhaps should have done. So for me, those stories, although roughly hewed and perhaps rudely written on the surface, aren't actually as rudely mechanical as perhaps they might come across, or perhaps as hayseedish as perhaps you might think on first encounter. But I think when you do look at Sherwood Anderson and all the amazing things that I'll say about him, when you first read him, I would imagine you're probably going to be kind of disappointed. Because he is not one of those writers where you read him for the beautiful luxuriousness of the sentences, or even for the fact that the perspective is different, or even just because they manage to delineate something strange within a sentence. Everything that he does is all on the surface. It all looks completely natural. And then you stop and you pause. And once you stop and you pause with Sherwood Anderson, you can actually see there's something very, very odd going on in the most simplest of sentences. And I would argue that in terms of short story writing, some of his sentences are the most interesting and unusual that you will come across, simply because of that dichotomy. The opposition between what is simple on the front of what you're reading and what's actually going on below it. And that all comes from you as a reader taking the time. I think one of the real issues with short stories in this day and age, in any day and age, but particularly now, is that we tend to read them too quickly. It's a natural thing, we can't help it, but we can read 2, 3, 5 short stories in a row, and that's fine. In an ideal world, what you'd really like to be able to do is to read one short story every single day, but read it slowly. And then perhaps read it again. And then if you're lucky, just before bed, read it one more time. That would be the ideal thing. Because what happens is that when you're reading a story and you're reading it quickly, you're not getting everything from it. And I think Sherwood Anderson is probably the master at that, where he's so readable and it's so quick, you don't even realise for half the time what's going on. So this is the very first sentence of Winsburg, Ohio. And it's very simple. The writer, an old man with a white moustache, had some difficulty getting into bed. Now, I think that is, on the face of it, a really dull sentence, and really not something that I would want to do if I was it's not his first book, it's his third book. But if that's the first sentence of the book, you want to hook people in. You want to make sure that people want to keep reading. And if you read any technical manual, listen to anybody, they'll say, hook people in with the first sentence. Call me Ishmael. Whatever it might be. With this, we've got the writer, an old man with a white moustache. The only thing that's good about him is he's got a white moustache, and he's got some difficulty getting into bed. But what's interesting about that sentence to me is this some difficulty. Okay, so change the sentence slightly. So the writer, an old man with a white moustache, had difficulty getting into bed. Now that, to me, that's an active sentence there. I'm thinking about that, and that man's he's trying to get into bed is difficult. But some difficulty getting into bed. Now that can mean two things. It can mean either he has quite a lot of difficulty getting into bed, or it could mean not that much difficulty getting into bed. That one word, suddenly you're not quite, once you stop and you pause at the end of that sentence, like, oh, well, what does that actually mean? And also, why has he got trouble getting into bed? Because if I was writing this, if I was writing this, I perhaps would say the writer, an old man with a white moustache, had some difficulty getting out of bed. Because there initially there's a question, so why are you stuck in bed? Ill? Been drugged? Someone abducted you? Whatever it is. There's a tension there already. And he's already subverted that because to get into bed. It's a whole different set of problems. So suddenly you're kind of like, well, where are we with this? Where are we with this story and this sentence? And it's just from holding it for a beat, because it's not on its own effective as a sentence. It will just make you, you've got two things will happen. Either you just race on to the next sentence, or you just go, oh, I'm not reading that. And those are the kind of two options that he's giving you. But what's interesting about it is at that sentence level, he is asking you and doing things just by putting certain kinds of words in there. And I think that's the absolute key to Anderson. It's absolutely why he works as a writer. This sleight of hand. This ability to present one thing and deliver something completely different. Because he's a writer based around oppositions. Oppositions colour all of his work. And in fact, when you think about all the great writing, they are about oppositions. And most of the great oppositions in life are reflected in art and are their principal concerns, whether that's war and peace, or love or hate, jealousy or indifference, or perhaps the most important one though, public versus private. And the public versus private thing is probably the second most covered kind of literary trope that there is. You know, whether that's Jekyll and Hyde, or whether that's in the crime novels that you might read, where you're talking about the person who presents one thing as a stand-up member of the community, but is in fact a depraved serial killer in the other. And that goes from all kinds of things, from those massive extremes just to the very, very tiny extremes. It's a particularly, I think, American, or at least it's expressed very well in American short story writing. In the introduction to the collector stories of Richard Yates, Richard Russo writes that Richard Yates understood that the great trauma for white America was small dreams not coming true. And if you read Revolutionary Road, that's entirely what it is. They have very, very small dreams and none of them come true. And I think that's that kind of dichotomy between public and private and what we want to have and what we can't have, and these very, very small things which seem just so close are not there. And I think Sherwood Anderson sets this stall out probably before any other American writer and sets the tone for every other American writer subsequent to that. And he does this with these incredible, wonderful sentences. I'm going to talk now about a story called Hands. It's an interesting story in lots of ways, but the reason why I particularly find it interesting is that in 1977, Allen Ginsberg put together this huge reading list. It was a massive reading list for his university out in, Texas or something, the Naropa Institute anyway, and it was called The Literary History of the Beat Generation. And it was Jean Genet, it was André Gide, it was Bukowski, it was Kerouac. It was all the kind of people you'd expect. Drug addicts, drunks, mystics, believers, friends of Allen Ginsberg, lovers of Allen Ginsberg. But also, in amongst all of these is Hands by Sherwood Anderson. And it sticks out a mile from all the other ones. Sherwood Anderson, this folksy, realistic writer. What's it doing there? Why did Ginsberg pick that story, when he's got all the world to go? Why this story? And I think, it might be a controversial position, but I think it's the first beat story. I really do. I think it's so close to the spirit without being able to go that extra mile. And yet, even though this is written in 1919, this story is still shocking now. It's still fiercely contemporary, even though despite its obvious time. Personally, I could go through the Hands line by line. I could go through it line by line and explain why I think these sentences are so important, even though they're not beautiful in the way, a Richard Ford sentence is beautiful, and they're not as perhaps shocking as something like Jane Anne Phillips might do with a sentence structure or any of those kind of writers. But still, there is a kind of folksy beauty to those sentences. So the opening line of Hands is this. Upon the half-decayed veranda of a small frame house that stood near the edge of a ravine, near the town of Winnisburg, Ohio, a fat little old man walked nervously up and down. Now, but what I love about that is that Philip Roth once said that you can read all of his book is in the first paragraph. The first paragraph of all of his books is there to sum up the entire novel, no matter how long or short it is. And I think Anderson does this in almost every one of his great stories. The entire story is summed up it's sometimes in the first sentence, sometimes in the first paragraph. And here, what we've got is an entire distillation of stories, themes, and concerns. And it's one sentence that rhythmically builds and builds and builds and shows one person caught between two very distinct words. You've got a ravine and you've got a town. You have civilization, you have danger. You have community, you have isolation. Really, really, really very, very simple. And again, so simple that perhaps you wouldn't even think about it, but suddenly he's got that opposition going straight away. And he has a fat little old man walking between the two. Fat little old man. Fat little old man. Fat man, old man, fat little old man. Instantly what you've got there is you sympathy for that man. A fat little old man. Oh, poor man. Between the ravine and the civilization. Really, really clever stuff. Very, very simple. Very conversational. And yet, you have ravine, you have the town, and you have a fat little old man who you are already kind of thinking, oh, well, I'm on your side, fat little old man. I'm going to stop saying fat little old man. And what happens next is there are a series, and he does this in all of his great stories, the oppositions build and build and build. So what happens next is some berry pickers go past. And they're all having larks, and they're all having fun. And they turn to Wings Biddlebaum, who's the fat little old man. And they turn to him, and they see him, and someone says in a high, shrill voice, commands him to brush his hair. Which Biddlebaum then does, except Biddlebaum is completely bald. So it's a really odd thing, it's very striking. But then there's the opposition anyway between the high, shrill voice and the command. Two things that don't really seem to go together. And then in the spirit of fun, one of the men tries to take away one of the women. And in this, the way that he presents it, we're never quite sure whether this is an abduction or whether this is just a bit of larks. So already we've got the opposition between the sexual worlds as well, between men and women, the high pitch of the voice from a man and the commanding. So you've got all of these different oppositions going on without anything ever happening. You don't even realise what's going on. It just seems like a jolly thing to be going on. It reminds me of Blake, actually. Like Sons of Innocence and Experience, where you think one thing's going on and something else is actually going on underneath it. And this goes on where the field where things should be growing, there's just mustard weeds growing. And this opposition goes on into the main bit of the story. And the reason why Biddlebaum is walking up and down, up and down, up and down, is waiting for his friend, George Willem, who is the recurrent character in Winsberg, Ohio. So he's waiting for George to arrive. And then this is the sentence that Anderson uses to introduce this. It says, with George Willard, son of Tom Willard, the proprietor of the new Willard house, he had formed something like a friendship. Something like a friendship. Is that a friendship? Something like a friendship. What does that actually mean? So he's waiting for him, but is something like a friendship? Does that mean that it's gone beyond friendship? Is it not a friendship at all? Is it getting towards being a friendship? And he adds in this note of uncertainty. And Sherwood Anderson uses uncertainty probably better than any writer of that period that I can think of. Certainty in writers, I always find quite worrying. They're very, very certain. Our characters feel exactly this or feel exactly that. With Anderson, you can look at it and you're never quite sure exactly, absolutely 100% what he's getting at, what exactly that means. And when he uses something like a friendship, it's entirely contingent on the reader's willingness to believe what's put in front of them. So what we then subsequently find out is that the not quite fullness of the friendship is due to Biddlebaum's social awkwardness, and something he describes in a beautiful phrase, his ghostly band of doubts. And now we get this weird break in the story. It's a very odd break in the story where suddenly we realise that the story isn't about him waiting for George to arrive. It's about his relationship with George, but also his relationship going back 20 years, and his relationship to the town folk. Because remember, he is in between the ravine and the town. So when he goes into town, he's kind of like a local celebrity because he has these massive hands. And these hands can pick out 140 quarts of strawberries in a day. And he's rightly famous in the town for these hands. And Anderson mentions all that, and the book starts with with the story is called The Story of the Grotesques, and he does describe his characters as grotesque. But so at this point, you're kind of thinking, oh, well, it's going to be something to do with his hands and, all this kind of thing. And then there's a break, and Anderson says, the story of Winged Battlebound is a story of hands. Okay, so suddenly you think you know where you are, and then he started telling you, suddenly you've got a certainty. The one thing you're absolutely certain of, that this is a story about hands. But of his hands? The story of Winged Battlebound is a story of hands. It's going to be clearly about his hands, but Anderson doesn't say that. He's a story of hands. So it's about hands in general. So he's gone from the specific to the general. And then he goes in. He says, the story of Winged Battlebound's hands is worth a book in itself. Sympathetically set forth, it would tap many strange, beautiful qualities in obscure men. So what's this got to do with his hands? Why are his hands suddenly the most important thing? And notice this story is now no longer really about him. It's just about his hands. And what we've got is a situation where even internally, this guy has got opposites. He has his hands and then he had his body. He is Winged Battlebound and he is his hands. He then goes on to say, this is a job for a poet. So even the very nature of this story that he's telling is not even being told in the correct way. A poet should be telling this story, not Anderson, not in a short story. So it's this uncertainty and this constant idea that something else is going on, that there are oppositions, and it just kind of separates everything out from there. And then we get to the point where we actually find out what the story's really all about, what the hands are all really about. We do that in a flashback. In a flashback, they are going out, George and Winged Battlebound are going out, and they're in a field, and George puts his hand, Winged Battlebound puts his hand on George. And at that moment, you already know, when he just says he put his hands on George, suddenly it is the story of the hands. Because it's, what does that movement make? What does it mean? Does it mean something else? Or does it just mean he touched it? Then later, in a kind of moment of kind of throwing anger, if you like, Battlebound tells George that he should do something with his life and not give in to fear. But then he says these chilling words, for once he forgot his hands. And you don't know what he's done at this point. It flashes back. He forgot his hands. These hands which are now no longer part of him. And then we get the full story. That actually, he's not really called Winged Battlebound. He's called Myers. And Myers, as he says, was run out of town by some nefarious teen who he was teaching. He was a teacher, as Anderson says, he was born to teach young men, and he's been pushed away. Now, this is all kinds very salacious. It's quite, and very contemporary as well. We can imagine the story being very much updated to our modern age. But at no point do we know whether there was any truth in the rumours. It's left up to us to decide precisely whether we think that he's done anything. And then, and the end of this is just so fantastic. He's alone in his house, realising that George is not going to come, he's not going to turn up. And he sits at home eating his frugal dinner with unbelievable rapidity. And it's this ending that comes like this unusual kind of ending, because suddenly you're like, are the hands part of him? Are the hands supposed to represent all of his kind of lusts, or is he just hungry? And it's that kind of division between what is on the surface and what lies beneath, what we believe in when we read something and what we take from that, which makes Anderson a very contemporary writer, a hugely contemporary writer. And on that, I think we'll stop.